Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast for grown-ups where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories. We're your hosts, Dr. Randall
and Dr. Caitlinn, two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us. This show will cover worldwide mythology, and Season 2 will explore mythological creatures found in folktales around the globe.
So join us as we laugh, talk, and sing for The Mything Link Season 2. Monsters and cryptids and beasts!
Oh my.
I think that was perfect.
Perfect.
Great. Oh my gosh, Caitlin. I'm so excited for Season 2.
I know you are. It makes me excited that you're excited.
Wait, but are you excited?
Yeah, I'm excited for this. I have a lot of, well, as you know, I have a lot of interesting hyperfixations due to my passion for things like anime and unusual reading material. So I'm excited to get into some of the actual mythology behind it.
Heck yeah. Oh, this is going to be so fun.
Excited.
This is going to be so fun. And I would love to invite our listeners that as we're moving through Season 2, slide into our DMs if you have any suggestions or requests for mythological creatures that you would like us to explore.
So fun.
So before we super dive into the creatures themselves, I want to do a little introduction to folklore and its functions, because basically these beasts, these monsters, these cryptids, they function as manifestations of these stories. So I want to zoom out just a little bit and get us started with a nice foundation to the season. And Dr. Caitlin, maybe that'll help you get a little more excited too.
I mean, researching the functions of folklore and cryptids today got me pretty stoked to be talking about this with you. So I think because folklore kind of inhabits and embodies some of my favorite aspects of the function of mythology, you know, the psychological parts of it. But we can get into that after you do the definition.
Let's define our terms to start with.
Let's define our terms.
I'm very passionate about making sure we're all in agreement on the terms that we're using. A lot of people use the words folklore and folktale as interchangeable, synonymous terms. And I would argue that while every folktale is a folklore, not every piece of folklore is a folktale. So when we're talking about folklore, that's kind of the umbrella term to refer to bits of knowledge and wisdom and recipes and superstitions and stories and everything that makes up what we'll talk about as the four functions of folklore. And folklore is spread both vertically and horizontally, in that it is passed down generation to generation, and it's also passed and spread peer to peer. And so we get it from both directions here.
That's what she said.
Yeah, she did.
Sorry.
So I like to think of folklore as culture that comes to us from the ground up. This is the culture of the everyday people who may not be literate, who might not have access to any money, power, wealth, status, anything like that. This comes from the culture that they were living. And I think that's one of the reasons I love it so much, is that it's not just the culture of the wealthy and the elite that we so often put up on some sort of pedestal. I would argue that every culture has folklore, but I think when we're thinking in a specific kind of historical sense of folk tales and folklore, oftentimes they're coming to us from more remote communities. That's typically what they're associated with, because they're the stories of the people. So they're outside the cities, and oftentimes the best preserved folk tales that we have come to us from both agricultural societies, but also tribal, traditional, indigenous communities. So I think a lot of the association with the words in today's society would associate these stories as stories of the people outside the cities.
Sure.
I would argue that folklore includes pretty much all aspects of life in a folk group, like recipes that are passed down, little ways of doing things, ways of keeping time. Folklorists will typically study like rhyming and hand games for children that like get passed on the playground. And when we're talking about folklore, it's shared by what folklorists call a folk group. And in other disciplines, we might call this a subculture, but a folk group is any group that shares values and traditions with each other. So they have like a shared cultural language. Oftentimes they share like belief systems, those types of things. So we could argue that like
Growing up Pennsylvania Dutch Mennonite was very much a folk group, right? We have our own, system of beliefs. There's an integration between the generational understanding of hex and witchcraft that's been married very subconsciously to forms of Christianity. I still have a recipe book that's like hundreds of years old sitting in my kitchen. There's specific ways of doing things. My mom quilts by hand just the way her mom quilted by hand and cross stitch. Like there's a long history of all these things being passed down from generation to generation. My dad still carpenters the same way that everybody else has always carpentered or whatever. You have things like barn raisings and all that kind of relational. We've talked a lot about oral traditions in the past, and that's a lot of how these non-tangible artifacts are gifted to one another and passed down from generation to generation.
right, it's just like how people are living outside of those
The
systems.
transmission of culture and communal history and
So when we're talking about a folk group, it could be like that, like Caitlin is describing as like a community of people who have this shared value system, but it can also be smaller than that. We could say that a folk group is a classroom who has set and determined their rules and the system that they're going to use, right? And so we could say that that classroom might have specific traditions, like expectations for decorations, for the order of operations in which they do things, what happens when somebody gets a good grade, right? Like, is there a celebration? What's a test prep like? All of those things. Like, it's all of these people sharing that. And so a person can belong to multiple folk groups. And from a folklore perspective, like gamers can be a folk group, or people who play like one specific type of game, or sports fans can be considered a folk group as well, because when you recognize that that other person is like wearing basically like a matching uniform to you, it gives you a sense of community and connection and camaraderie. And so folk groups can be any of those things, but the way that we're probably most likely going to be using it this season is like how Caitlin was saying, like a specific group of people who either share like typically who share geography, because we're going to be talking about folk tales,
all right, so what would you say the
like a
four major
culture.
functions of folklore are?
Well, what folklorist William Bascom says is the four major functions of folklore is that folklore serves to amuse or entertain, to validate culture, to educate, and to maintain conformity. And one thing, so folk tales are specifically the pieces of folklore that are like narrative stories that we typically think of when we think of folklore. And folk tales typically don't start off as an official piece of literature or propaganda or anything like that. Like I said, folklore comes to us from the bottom up. And oftentimes these stories were created to be told in a community setting, and they serve those four functions of folklore in which they're typically educating children on the value system of the community. So it validates the culture by both establishing and reinforcing cultural behaviors and norms. And we'll see examples of that in like gender roles and familial roles, right? When we're looking at like Genesis in the Christian Bible and the Hebrew Bible is a really great example of the functions of these folk tales, like who's responsible for cooking and cleaning and providing food and all of those things. Like these narrative stories serve as a way to teach these behavioral norms and to reinforce them by both positive and negative examples. So a positive example would be like somebody being rewarded for something that for exemplary behavior, right? They win a prize based on this trait. And then a negative example would present a character who deviates from the norm in some way and then gets punished for it. And typically when we're looking at folk tales, especially with cryptids, like that's the example that we're getting, is this example of negative behavior. So these warning tales, they'll standardize and encourage cultural norms. And I like to think of them as like a vaccine or an inoculation. And I know we've talked about this a little bit, but this idea of folk tales as an inoculation is really fun for me because it allows people to experience stories at a distance and get a small taste of it before having to be in that situation themselves. So then if they're ever in a similar situation themselves, they have a little bit more like psychic muscle memory where they've thought about their reaction and are able to put it into play in a better way. And it makes the world a little less scary if you have practiced being scared a little bit and a little bit each time. It really gives kids like a safe dose of that danger to experience those anxieties and then realize they're okay on the other end of that story. And people see themselves in stories and can remember stories better than they can remember like a list of rules. And it also gets into this idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations. And if we use Little Red Riding Hood, one of my favorite examples, Little Red Riding Hood teaches us to listen to our parents, to not stray from the path, to not talk to strangers and give them personally identifying information. And she gets punished for it. In some versions of the story, she's able to survive past the punishment and learn her lesson. And if you send a little kid out and tell them, stay on the path, don't tell people your information, blah, 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 oftentimes those instructions go in one ear or out the other, in one ear and out the other. But if you remind them, like, remember Little Red, do you want to make the same decisions as her or not? Like all of a sudden it feels like the kid making the decision themselves because they identify with the protagonist and they decide whether they want that to be their positive example or negative example. And it's easier for them to have some autonomy over that decision making when it's given to them in folktale
Mhm.
format. And that's one of my
Mhm.
favorite pieces too.
The psychological function of folklore and folk tales is perhaps my favorite function, if you will, if I'm allowed to have
Mm.
one.
Oh yeah, you were allowed to have one.
Exactly what you're saying. It provides a safe space for children and arguably adults to face their deepest fears in a way that they can look the fear in the eye, have tea with it, in the words of Helen, sit down at the table with their demons and walk away relatively unscathed, but with a new understanding of what they've just faced. Hearing a folk tale and participating in the listening and retelling of that enables us to not only cope with our fears and uncertainties, but it also helps us to address existential questions about the way we take up space in the world, the way our community takes up space in the world, the way our fears take up space in the world. And I think part of it is not just hearing those stories and being able to make those decisions for yourself because you've related to the protagonist, but retelling those tales after you've been introduced to them and inoculated with them. Retelling those stories is also a way that we psychologically process and cope with our uncertainties and our fears and our existential questions and the unknown. So it's a recognition of what we know about ourselves and the world around us. In the same breath, it's a recognition that there's things that we will never know. There will always be a place in society for fear and for not knowing what's around you. And that is not meant to hold us back. It's meant to spur us into discovery about the world around us, about ourselves. It's a way of teaching us how to make decisions about the way that we're moving forward in life. Folk tales are, I would argue, like a psychological comfort in the sense that they're helping us or teaching us to take up space in the world as ourselves and also as part of our community and also as part of the greater unknown. So there's like multifold layers to what's happening when we talk about the function of folklore and the function of folktale.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were talking about like our relationship with the unknown and our fear of the unknown. And I feel that's like the cryptid sweet spot, right? That these creatures serve to become a manifestation of the unknown and a way to process our fears around the unknown, right? Because the fear of the unknown is always scarier than the fear of something we know and understand. And I see a lot of these cryptids as humanity's attempts to make a catch-all for them, right? Any unidentified animal you see like now belongs to this category or is a confirmed sighting of this animal. And it lessens anxieties in ways, right? Like just as these stories of the boogeymen and Bigfoot and the Wendigo, like these monsters serve as scary warning stories, but also they allow us to process our anxieties like in a safe way and project them onto this beast that now has identifiable qualities that we could quantify. And it makes it less scary.
They're vessels for cultural narratives. They're
Yes. Ooh, I love that.
containers for societal fears, right? Like with the Wendigo, what's the idea here is you don't wander off alone in the winter or else you get eaten by something unexplainable, right?
Right, like so many of these creatures, they exist on the boundaries of not necessarily the boundaries of society like a trickster would, but like on the boundaries of places where it's not okay to go. And we all know, right? Like if you tell a kid don't push the red button, that's all they can think about. And it makes me think of in Lion King when Simba and Nala go to the elephant graveyard because they know that that's the one place they're not allowed to go. And if you tell kids, don't go in this deep cave, don't go by the river, don't go next to the cliff, don't go deep into the woods, you might fall in and die. They need to have a healthy fear for that. And anyone who spent more than 5 minutes around a toddler knows that toddlers don't have intrinsic healthy fears of the world around them. That's not instinctual to us as humans. We have to learn that. And folk tales teach kids to be scared of these places by putting a physical, tangible monster there because the real monster is the cave itself, with a kid getting lost in there, wandering around and dying. The monster is the river itself. Instead of a wailing ghost of a woman in white by the river who drowned her children and is going to drown yours too, the river itself will take your child and drown them. And it functions in such a way to preserve not only culture, but the people themselves and to, like you said, become a vessel for that culture and to become a vessel for the fears and anxieties of that culture and present them to children in a really tangible, digestible way.
Absolutely. I would argue at the same time that, on the same side of the coin, the positives of these folk tales would be that they challenge human self-centeredness. All of a sudden, there's a wide unknown. There's creatures out there that we can't possibly fathom or understand that threaten our place in the hierarchy of the world around us and encourage us not to just be okay with the status quo. So as an adult hearing a folktale, these cryptids and creatures reinforce a sense of wonder in us. They reinforce curiosity and that the fear of the unknown isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's so much out there to venture into and discover, and they're cautionary figures, and at the same time, they're figures of wonder. There's a reason that we're here talking about cryptids, and there's a reason why we've been talking about going on a Bigfoot expedition. And it's because these things are terrifying in a way that makes you want to chase after them.
Mhm.
And that's really beautiful. There's no, like, clear line. There's a gray area between, just like there's a questionable line between love and hate, there's a questionable line between warnings and adventure, right? I guess that's not
Mhm.
necessarily the word duality that I wanna use here, but
Fear and bravery,
fear and bravery. There's
right?
places that
Yeah.
are untouched by humans because they're terrifying and you shouldn't go into that cave or else you'll die, but at the same time, what's in the fucking cave, man? Maybe when you're big enough, you can know, can find out.
Yeah, I love that. The spirit of adventure for sure. And if we think about it, there are so many creatures that were once relegated to this realm of folklore or cryptid that have been proven to be real. And that's that idea if the exception proves the rule, right? Like the giant squid has been proven to be real. The giant squid wasn't captured on video until 2004. And so that is a creature that really recently has entered the official scientific record. And it wasn't until the late 1800s that an entire full one had been found. And so, like, it begs the question, like, could Bigfoot be real? And we just haven't found evidence yet.
This makes me think of a question that I've been wanting to ask you since I started researching this. I've decided on my answer already, or at least I
Okay.
knew it before
Okay.
I formulated the question.
All right.
But
Let's hear it.
this begs the question, which is very much in tandem with every other question that I feel like we've asked to each other over the course of this podcast. But just because they are not substantiated by Western science, does that make them any less real? Does it matter? Does it matter if Bigfoot's not real? Scientifically, does it matter if the Wendigo isn't an actual physical creature?
I'd say from a folkloric and mythological perspective, no, it doesn't matter. But I would also say that the word cryptid itself means that it's an animal that only exists in story and isn't part of the scientific record. So I think for us to be even having these conversations of categorizing these creatures like means that we're coming to it from a Western perspective. And the Western perspective does say that, yeah, it does matter if it's real or not. And I'd say for the people who are like looking for Bigfoot, they're looking for evidence. Are they looking to maybe have their own like interaction with Bigfoot and like that would be the magic? I'm sure that's a big part of it, but they're searching for evidence that Bigfoot is real. And so I think the whole field of cryptozoology would say, yes, we're on a quest to prove that these creatures are real. But from my mythological viewpoint, yeah, they're already real because we act as if they're real. And like I said before, the real danger lies in the caves and the rivers and these places that do take human life. You know, what is the real monster? Does a real monster have to have a concrete, like, physical form to be considered a monster? I think these are just ways of describing these unfathomable, monstrous pieces of life that we have to deal with and giving them form and shape and name, and it becomes easier to talk about them. And I think that's as real as anything that I have sitting in front of me. As real as
My
this chair I'm
question
sitting
was,
in.
oh yeah. My question was spurned because I don't necessarily think of things in terms of Western science very often, unless it's my own medical caretaking things.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
when I was researching this and I was like looking at what the words cryptid and cryptozoology actually mean, I was like genuinely confused about the search for evidence, the search to prove that they're real, because in my mind, that's just not something that I really ever compute, like, what the hell does real even mean? And that's like
Right.
the working of my own brain. The actual study of like cryptozoology, I was like, this feels complicated to me. I felt confused reading about the scientific study of trying to prove the reality of these creatures when, of course, they're fucking real. Why would that ever, what does that even mean? So that's just the way that I perceive things in the world. When we've been talking about like a Bigfoot expedition, my idea in my head wasn't like, oh, we need to find evidence. It was, oh, community. Oh, reminder that I am not the only thing in the universe. Oh, reminder that there's mystery and beauty and
Mhm.
adventure and magic out there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, do I think we're gonna find a Bigfoot when we go on our Bigfoot expedition? I don't really have any expectations about that. It's about going and engaging with the
The
story
story.
and in community with people who are really passionate about it and hearing what they're doing and seeing what they're doing. And I mean, would I love to have a close encounter with a Bigfoot in the middle of the night, in the middle of the woods? Absolutely. Would I wanna package and sell that encounter or that proof? Not necessarily. That wouldn't be what it's about for me. But also, like, it's just magical to be out in the woods in the middle of the night. And that's a place where I don't usually live. That's a place I don't usually exist, and it's fun for me to have new experiences, and that would be a new experience. And I've gone on, like, some ghost hunting things, and I've seen some, like, different types of equipment for different I guess they'd fall under the lump of pseudosciences or the occult or whichever. But yeah, I love camping. I love being outside. I would be excited to do those things anyway. And now it's going to be centered around storytelling of Bigfoot. Like that is really exciting for me. Big ol' nerd.
Something that I've been thinking about as well is like I just got this fun little book on the yokai, the Japanese folklore.
Oh my gosh,
And
cute.
I know it's so cute and it's like really beautifully illustrated as well. But I think about shikigami or yokai, like spirits and ghosts and things that are real, but you don't see them. Like ghosts, you don't see them, but they're still there.
Not seeing them as part of it.
Yeah. So that's just something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, it feels like, especially like in the terms of Bigfoot, kind of what I've been chewing on in my brain here the last couple minutes is like it's this confrontation of the shadow type situation, right? Like we watched M. Night Shyamalan's The Village this weekend, Caitlin and I. And if you want to look into the functions of folklore, that's a great movie to do it with. The idea is there's this like agricultural rural village and they live in the woods surrounded by monsters. And they're scared to go into the woods and the monster's color is red. And so they like don't have any red in their society and their color is yellow. So there's these scenes where the youths of the village stand out with their back to the woods and see how long they could keep standing there for, like exposed, and essentially inviting the monsters to come attack them. And that feels like such like an initiation ritual, a coming of age ritual, a scene where you have to like confront your darkest fears and see what you can do about it, right? Like an entrance to the haunted house. And I feel like we'll have that opportunity to do that on our Bigfoot trip, I guess is what I'm saying. Be a little spooked, get a little adrenaline.
Stand with our backs to the woods.
Mm,
Yeah, the mention of the village made me think of part of the function of folklore is the preservation of culture, the preservation of traditions, values, beliefs, historical record keeping. And you definitely see that. You see the function of folklore as a sort of tool for strengthening community identity and social cohesion in the village because the story they're telling about the beast in the red cloak are ones that bring their community closer together, closer to depending on each other, closer to preserving their way of life,
mhm.
and also at the same time instilling fear about other ways of life.
So you saying a cryptid could function as a social scapegoat of sorts,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
If we're projecting our fears and anxieties onto it, yeah, we're giving the people a common enemy that
Right.
helps bond them together. Absolutely.
Right. So at the same
Mhm.
time, it's preserving, what is seen as the positive things of the community. It's also giving those who don't value those things a way to participate in that community and foster a sense of belonging among people who don't even necessarily agree about the same aspects of tradition and culture. And
Absolutely, and if an outsider were to have an interaction with one of these cryptids or monsters, that could be their inroads to bonding with the community. Or it could also be a way that they're pushed out. I'm thinking of, the Headless
sure,
Horseman and the Legend of Sleepy
sure.
Hollow. Ichabod Crane's interactions with this folkloric creature had him laughed out of society.
Yeah, but then if you think about, like, in Christianity, if somebody sees a demon or sees something mystical, it'll often drive them to the church because the church
Mhm,
has the lore and the tale to explain something like that,
mhm,
right?
and they have the answers.
And they have the
Yeah.
answers, and then those other outsiders are accepted into that fold because they've seen the telltale signs of that lore, right?
See, and that's what I was initially thinking, but now that we're talking about that, like when I was thinking about Sleepy Hollow, I'm like, no, it does the opposite with Ichabod Crane. But I'm thinking too, though, during that time period, the Headless Horseman is based on an older Irish folk tale. And
Mhm.
if Ichabod Crane would have been marking himself like in alignment with the Irish at a time where they were being so discriminated against and not respected, then that would get him laughed out of society, right? Because that's not the cultural in group. That's not the folk group that created that story. They're the outside colonizing force.
Which brings up another really important part of folklore and folktale
Mhm.
is that it's
Mhm.
a way to resist, subvert, reject, protest, challenge dominant narratives. It is a way to inspire social change or resist
Mhm.
colonialism.
It's also a way to explain colonialism
Absolutely.
as like giving the monster of colonialism, like when we talk about the Wendigo, one of the etymological explanations for the name is that it comes from an Ojibwe word that means winter cannibal monster. And some Ojibwe sources claim that this was an explanation for colonization. So we'll explore that more in our episode on the Wendigo. But it could give a nameless, faceless enemy that has so many different faces can now turn into some sort of shape-shifting monster that you never know what it's going to look like. And the monster is colonialism.
Also, if you think about, this is just a side note, but if you think about where the Ojibwe people live, winters are really harsh,
Mm-hmm.
often snowy
Mm-hmm.
experiences that blanket the entire earth and are not always welcome.
Yep, absolutely.
You talking about how, particularly with the Wendigo, these are folk tales or artifacts that can be used to explain things like colonialism and arguably things that cannot be controlled, like natural phenomena and weather anomalies and all those kinds of things. I would argue that, superstitions and charms and those kinds of things fall under the category of folklore. And those are ways to control the uncontrolled. Here's an example that is, obviously on the forefront of my mind. Ice hockey players are notoriously superstitious. They will wear the same socks for every game. They will not wash
Mm-hmm.
their underwear for every game. They will sleep with a puck under their pillow. They have all these little things that they do to control the outcome of something that is perceived uncontrollable, right? You don't know if you're going to win the game. You hope that you win the game. So you do all these little superstitious things to control the outcome, right? And I think that's one of the things that falls under the category of folklore, is that you have cultures that really value things like charms and prayers and
Mm-hmm.
recipes and all those kinds of
Talismans and yeah,
talismans, and
absolutely.
to give a sense of control in circumstances that cannot be controlled.
Mm-hmm. 100%. And that's why there's such a big overlap. Like the borders or the definitions of folklore and mythology, they serve a lot of similar functions, and a lot of stories can be considered both folklore and mythology. But I'd say that oftentimes stories of folklore are not necessarily believed to be factually true in the way that we could consider a lot of mythology followers and believers consider them to be factually true, but that folk tales contain the truth of what it means to belong to this group, right? And the things that we value. And so I would say that sometimes we do know who the author of folk tales are, whether they collected them or they wrote them down or they like authored them as a literary story. I think could still function in a similar way or in the same way as a folktale in this category, because it's more about the emotional and cultural truth of the story. So we could make up a tale that reinforces those cultural norms and behavioral standards and that type of thing, um, in a way that I don't see overlapping with mythology.
That's one of my favorite things about folklore. I'm glad that you said that and put words to it, because something that I've obviously struggled with for a long time is the way that the mythology of particularly Christianity has been concretized to be like historical factual truth.
Mm-hmm.
With folklore, there is what what I was telling you that I like often teach when I teach Genesis. Just because something's not historically true doesn't make it any less true. And folklore has that kind of inherent understanding of that gray statement. It doesn't matter if it was not a historical event, right? The idea is that it's teaching the child to not go by the river by themselves, to not go in the cave by themselves. That's the
Right.
truth here. It's not that Little Red Riding Hood actually talked to a wolf who was pretending to be her grandmother. It's that kids don't wander into the woods themselves, and
Right.
it doesn't matter if
It's
it's enlightenment flavored true or not. That's not the
mhm,
fucking
mhm.
point.
It's
I love
the
that.
truth is that a girl just like you on a night just like tonight was thinking about doing something specific, and here's how that went. right? The truth is in the story. The truth is the storytelling. The truth is in that transmission of culture and story. Like it exists on the boundary where it both functions as true and it also doesn't need to be true. And I love that kind of like juxtaposition, this really interesting space that folklore takes up.
We were just talking in our last episode about how Greek mythology can be really triggering because it's these stories that can become conflated with being like historically true. You know, it's difficult to hear the stories of Greek mythology and find solidarity in them because you can see yourself really tangibly in those characters, and
Mhm.
that is really traumatizing. But with folklore, you're being confronted with your fears without that like installation of trauma.
Right, like it's outside the structures of the patriarchy, like it's more about your own process, like that individuation or confrontation of the shadow or overcoming your own fears. But also like folklore as it relates to like recipes or handicrafts or those kind of bits and bobs of culture. I love the practicalities that are solved in creative ways. And like, I feel like so much of folklore are these little like particularities of a culture, like what's the best way to keep time, and a lot of little rhyming sayings that help people remember things more easily, like little mnemonic devices and stuff. And I'm sure in your community, there are like quilting and sewing techniques that are very specific that might not work the best, might not be the easiest, but they're part of the tradition because at some point that was the best option. And now it's part of what marks you as being part of that tradition, an insider to that culture. And those types of things are so magical and special to me. And they're usually born out of necessity, and again, like coming from the bottom up, like what our ancestors are teaching us instead of like what the political structures are requiring from us.
Yeah, I'm thinking particularly of in Pennsylvania Dutch culture, there is a folk art form of a hex sign, which is what it is translated as in English. And there's a formulaic way that this art is done. There's, expression like I'm trying to use English words here. There's like stylized birds and hearts and tulips and trees that are put onto these, it's like a circular sign with the shape of a star. And often included are those birds and compasses and trees and all those kinds of things. They were a talisman, a protective talisman, and Pennsylvania Dutch people would hang them on the outside of their barns, and they're still a common sight, even though most Pennsylvania Dutch culture at this point is almost, at least where I'm from, exclusively Mennonite. And so you have this marriage of like an old folk tale that doesn't necessarily like include the original story of that folk tale, but you find all these Christian Mennonite people putting these signs on their barns anyway, not necessarily because they know why, but because it's now part of the greater culture at large. I think Pennsylvania Dutch barn hex signs are like really fun. And I'm thinking too, like, my parents are super anti everything. I wasn't even allowed to like read Harry Potter growing up, right? Like I was only allowed to watch specific TV and all that kind of stuff. And you know what my mom has cross stitchings of in our house? The Distelfink and Pennsylvania Dutch hex signs. And I don't even think she knows really what they mean, but they're still there as like just something that I've always seen in every Pennsylvania Dutch Mennonite house.
And it's like a reminder of our culture and it makes us feel at
Right.
home, even if the
Uh-huh.
initial, yeah, absolutely. Like
Right.
that's
Like
how I
I've
feel about
considered
so
getting a
many of our,
tattoo about it.
yeah,
It
it
just
feels like home. And it doesn't
exactly.
matter where it came from or the historic, right? Like you were saying or before, like does it matter if it's historically real or not? And that's how I feel about so many of our wedding customs today. It's a lot of folk traditions that have been passed down that the original meaning is lost, but we're still participating in these pieces of the ritual. And in some cases, like with the white wedding dress, it's been retroactively assigned meaning based on what somebody thinks. And to not leave people hanging, I know you already know this. The reason we wear white wedding dresses is because Queen Victoria wore a white wedding dress and it became stylish and trendy and popular because white was a color that was reserved for the elites because white is notoriously hard to keep clean, easily stained. So common folk of that time would wear clothes with a pattern on it, like a paisley or a floral or something like that. And not only was the dress white, but it was only worn once. And that was like an ultimate status symbol. And that's where we got the tradition of wearing white dresses from. And it wasn't until it had become popular for so long and spread so wide that somebody asked, why do we do this? And nobody was really
It's because
around,
you're a
like,
virgin.
right. And so they said, oh, well, white is the color of purity and virginity. And now that's become a symbol, to the point where when I wore a black dress at my wedding, I love this, one of my friends gave her daughter a little pep talk before my wedding to help manage her expectations and let her know that's not all brides wear white. I thought it was so cute when she told me about it. She gave her a little rundown because she's like, I know Randall and she's not going to be wearing a white dress. And this is how you can have a wedding and a bride and still be fancy without wearing a white dress. And it's just like one of many cultural things that we participate in, little folk customs that has lost its meaning. And because I'm a big nerd and know the meaning, I'm like, nope, I'm not going to participate in that empty ritual. Like, I want something to have meaning to me, which
I
is,
wish I'd gotten married older, because I absolutely would have worn a black dress if I had even gotten married like a year or two later.
your wedding was beautiful.
It was, but I was the ripe old age of 21, so
Yeah, I was maybe 29 when I got married.
yeah, that's an
28
age
or
I would
29.
I would not recommend 21.
Yeah, but look how our marriages are at this point. I don't
Anyway,
know.
weddings are
Weddings are a thing.
a
Um,
thing.
so yeah, so like we still engage in like folk traditions and rituals and all of those things, but you're from a much more like closed tradition than I grew up in. But I grew up in like your classic, not quite religious, kind of in the suburbs, kind of rudderless, like post-colonial colonizer upbringing. My descendants are colonizers. We don't have connection to this land. We don't have traditions. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, but my dad is from Texas. And my mom was also born and raised in Los Angeles, but her mom was from Pennsylvania and came out to like live her Hollywood dreams. And my dad came out to live his Hollywood dreams. So like that's like as far back as my connection to the land goes. And I don't share those Hollywood dreams. And so LA is not a place I live any longer. And that's what I love about folklore and folk life, is so many of these tiny little bits and bobs of culture. My mom is mostly Czechoslovakian, and so we have a few little pieces of culture that's come down to us. And even those little tiny pieces that I know like just came from my grandma, like they help me feel so connected to my ancestors in a way that I can't even fathom people coming from like rich folkloric cultural traditions. It's absolutely incredible. And when we get to our interview with Jane in our Irish folklore episode, we talk a little bit about that, how Ireland has historically been a more closed society and everybody knows everybody and knows if they don't know you, they know your family. And the connection to the land and to the community is something that I won't ever probably experience as an insider. And it's something that holds so much magic for me, because it's something, right, like that I feel like I'll never understand. And I'm sure I'm looking at it in ways that are impractical and dreamlike, because I'd love to experience humanity the way humanity was designed for, I guess, is what I'm
Sure.
saying. It'd be cool. It'd be cool to be a visitor in that land. All right. Well,
Okay.
I am super, super, super excited to get more into folktales and cryptids, and I know you
Beasts.
hate it, but I'm
Oh
gonna say it.
my.
Critters.
Ooh. Ugh.
I'm so
Hey, all you
excited.
cats and critters.
Oh no. Hey, all you cool cryptids and critters.
Okay, let's. Thanks for joining us on the Mything Link, all you cool cats and kittens.
Monsters and cryptids and beasts.
Oh my.
Oh my, indeed. It is going to be a wild season. So hopefully y'all stick around. tell your friends. And I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to do some real like boots on the ground research for this season. And I am so, so, so excited to have more excuses to see you and more excuses to just engage with storytelling and people in different settings. I'm so excited. I love you
I'm
so much.
excited too. I love you so much.
Hell yeah. All right.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Ulyate and Caitlinn Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlinn Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwehcollective.org. Thanks for listening.
Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. Shut the fuck up, Carol.